we've been a small team so far, but we've been working with Effect from scratch. So when I decided the stack for Spiko, I chose the Effect because it was the natural successor to FPTS. And for hiring people, most of the employees didn't know Effect before they came at Spiko. And I trained them, and they also trained with the documentation. And so far, it's been okay. I think the documentation has really improved. There is still a learning curve that is a bit higher than other libraries, but I think it's okay.
Welcome to Cause and Effect, a podcast about the TypeScript library and ecosystem called Effect, helping engineers to build production-ready software. I'm your host, Johannes Schickling, and I've been building with Effect for over 4 years. With this podcast, I want to help others understand the powers and benefits of using Effect. In this episode, I'm talking to Samuel Briole, CTO at Spiko, which is a Paris-based FinTech startup trusted with over 400 million euros under management. In this conversation, we dive deep into Spiko's event-driven architecture built entirely with Effect and how they leverage RabbitMQ as an event broker to scale their backend systems. Let's get into it. Hey, Samuel, it's so great to have you on the podcast. How are you doing?
Hi, I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing fantastic. I'm quite impressed with what you all are building, and I want to learn a lot more. But before getting into what you're building, would you mind introducing yourself and sharing what you do?
Sure. So I'm Samuel. I'm CTO at Spiko, and we are a French startup based in Paris. So we are a FinTech, especially in the finance sector, and we are building a new infrastructure for issuing regulated financial products on public blockchains. And we especially focus on risk-free products. We allow people to buy bonds of the French state or of the US state, so they can have a risk-free rate. So they can earn a risk-free rate on their cash. So basically, if you're based in the US, it's a very common thing to have a risk-free rates yielding on your cash. But in Europe, it's not very common to have that. Our mission is to democratize this kind of products. We launched Spiko 1 year ago, and the company was created 1 year before. So we've been working for 2 years. And we launched our products 1 year ago, and today we have around 400 million euros under management, which is quite a nice milestone. And also last month we raised a Series A. So we raised with Index Ventures, which is famous for supporting the Revolut and Robinhood in the same financial sector.
That is awesome. Well, first of all, congratulations on those amazing milestones, like 400 million under management or whatever is the best way to put it. That is impressive. And then also congrats on the Series A with Index Ventures. I'm curious to learn a little bit more about both your personal background, how you arrived there, but also about how I should think about Spiko as a company, how many engineers are working at Spiko. So maybe you can give a little bit more detail here.
Sure. I did an engineering school where I learned physics, and I almost started a PhD in quantum physics. But at some point, I decided that I didn't want to do research, and I switched to software engineering. So during my studies, I was building an app for discovering electronic music. So I learned to code a bit by myself, and I was like, okay, this is so cool. I want to do this as my job. I started my career in a small service company, and quickly I wanted to build my product from scratch. So I worked for a company called Inato. I was maybe the second engineer. And then I tried to launch my own startup, and I failed 2 times. And then I met the founders of Spiko, and I found the mission really exciting, and also the the technological challenge at Spiko, using the blockchains and also innovating both on the tech side and on the financial side, was very exciting. So that's how I arrived at Spiko.
That is awesome. And there's quite a bit of like overlap there with like other people in the Effect community. You mentioned the folks at Inato. Like I had the pleasure of meeting some of them throughout the last two Effect conferences. And it seems like there's quite the active Effect scene in Paris, which I'm sure we'll talk a little bit later about as well. But yeah, that journey so far sounds really, really cool. I see a bunch of parallels and similarities. Like I'm currently still working on a music app for me personally focused on electronic music. So we should certainly seem to share that passion here. But now you're CTO at Spiko. So what does that entail? And how many other engineers are you working with?
The engineering team at Spiko is currently 5 people, and there is one joining soon. And our goal is to reach around, I think, 10 people next year. So we split into probably 2 teams. We've been a small team so far, but we've been working with Effect from scratch. So everyone in the team is using Effect, and everyone is doing TypeScript and Effect in the team.
That is awesome. So you mentioned to me before that you joined as the first employee besides the founders. So you were there from the very beginning. And the other engineers who joined afterwards, did they have any prior Effect experience or any other relevant experience besides TypeScript? Or I'm just curious, like how I should think about the sequencing. Now Spiko has been around for 2 years. You've probably written some of the first lines of code. And then the other engineers you brought on, was it a prerequisite for them to already know Effect? Did you train them?
No, it's not a prerequisite. I discovered functional programming at Inato when I was working at Inato, and we used FPTS. And then when I decided to choose like the stack for Spiko, I chose the Effect because it was the natural successor to FPTS. And for hiring people, most of the employees didn't know Effect before they came at Spiko. I think none of them knew Effect. And I trained them, and they also trained with the documentation. And so far, it's been okay. I think the documentation has really improved. There is still a learning curve that is a bit higher than other libraries, but I think it's okay. Also, at Spiko, we have, we are all full stack and DevOps, and we do all kinds of things. And we also develop smart contracts. And so far, we don't have specialized roles in tech. So when we hire people, we try to hire people who can quickly jump on new technologies and learn these technologies. So far, everyone has been learning Effect.
That is awesome. Congratulations on that. I share that similar path to you, that I found my way to Effect through functional programming. But I do think that this won't be what brings most people to Effect these days, and certainly in the future. So I'm curious, like, what is your teaching methodology when you bring on someone new to the team? Are you precisely already looking for someone with functional programming backgrounds? Or are you rather like not mentioning FP at all? Like how you're explaining Effect to new engineers?
It's a good question. I don't mention functional programming. I just say it's inspired by functional programming concepts. But I don't think it's a good way to put it, to say it's functional programming, because it's not. I prefer to describe Effect as a framework that has type level error and included dependency management. So basically in TypeScript, by default, you would have the success type of a function that is correctly typed. But here you have also errors and dependencies. So I think it's a simple way to put it. Like you have both the success, the error, and the dependencies.
So maybe we can switch gears slightly and talk a little bit more about the architecture of the product that you're building. So maybe we can start by you describing which sort of like consumer facing parts there are. Is there maybe a mobile app? Is there a web app? Are there some other primitives? And then switching gears and describing more of like the backend architecture.
So far we have 3 apps, 3 front-end apps written in TypeScript and React. We are building a platform that connects financial product issuers, distributors, and also we have like the admin, like the admin interface. So we have 3 types of users in our system: investors, distributors, and admins. So basically, we build 3 apps, and they are all connecting to 3 APIs. And all these APIs are connected to backend services. And so the way we designed our backend is we build, I would say, not microservices, but I would say macro services. It's not a monolith, but we have like a few services. One service to manage, fund operations, one to manage orders, one manages the blockchain stuff. So that's how we designed our backend.
Got it. And so given those different APIs, I assume you're using the various building blocks that Effect provides for that. So for example, the Effect HTTP packages from the platform?
Absolutely. So at the beginning, when we started, there was no platform package in Effect. I think it was 2 years ago. And platform almost did not exist, I think. So the first thing I did was wrapping Express into Effect, which came up as a very bad idea because it was a mess to manage dependencies. And I had like some non-Effect code in my code base, which wasn't really nice. So basically my entry point wasn't an Effect. It was an Express server, and the Effect was in each endpoint handler. I had to Effect.run premise my code. But later the Effect platform package came in Effect, and we switched to it. And at the time there was no HTTP API module, so we used Effect HTTP, which was a lib written by Milan Suk. We used it for a while, actually. And I even met Milan at the first Effect conference. And it was like awesome to meet everyone at this conference. But yeah, we used it for a while. And then HTTP API module arrived, and we switched to it. We migrated everything to it now.
Yeah, I mean, I remember those transitions well. Similar to you, where like I also used FPTS in the past, where you got those like much more fine granular primitives, but not as high level of a thing such as like an HTTP module. And I still remember getting something really nice, like getting those primitives from Effect, but having to give up on higher level primitives where you mentioning Express or Koa or like all of those different things. You arguably had better primitives, like you had middlewares, etc. And now you kind of you got one thing, but you had to give up of another thing. And now you're kind of wondering, what should I do about this? And you did a similar thing as I did, which is like trying to rebuild those higher level primitives. But now it's so nice that it was always just a matter of time until the Effect ecosystem and the Effect core would give us some of those primitives. And now finally the time has come over the last year or so. And if you're going through that transition, it's just so nice how much code you can delete and how everything just fits like a glove. So I want to learn more about the backend, but maybe briefly to wrap up on the front end first. How much or how little are you using Effect on the front end? Are you stopping by basically consuming the HTTP APIs, or are you using Effect in a more involved way on the front end?
No, we use it only for data fetching. So, but it's very convenient because with the HTTP API module, you can write APIs in the declarative way. So you have a auto-generated client, which is type safe. So basically, we have a lib that exports the HTTP API specification, and we have the client. We just import the client from the app. But maybe in the future we could use it even in a more involved way, but it's not the case yet.
Got it. That makes sense. So yeah, let's talk a little bit more about the backend. So you mentioned already those like 3 pillars of your application, like if I remember correctly, like the investor facing ones, then the distributor facing ones, and then the admin, which I suppose is like your company. So at the minimum for each of those, there seems to be an HTTP API, but then you also need to interface somehow with like external services. So is that all done from those HTTP APIs, or are there some other parts in the system, maybe like some message bus, or maybe you can explain a little bit more of like how the backend works and how Effect helps there.
As I told you, we have multiple services in our backend, and they sometimes need to communicate between one and another. So the first thing we did was to build an internal API. So for each service, we built an internal HTTP API because it was the same technology as external APIs. So it was easy for one service to call another service. We had the same auto-generated client. Everything was type safe. So it felt very nice. And at some point, we had to run some background jobs. For instance, an investor wants to create an order and we need to send him an email. But before sending the email, we need to generate a PDF, and a lot of stuff has to happen. And it will take maybe several seconds, maybe 10 seconds, I don't know. But we want to do it as a background job so we can answer with the HTTP response quickly. So the first thing we did was using our internal API, but we used something to avoid blocking the HTTP response. So we used effect.fork daemon. So we would fork the execution of an internal API call into the global scope. So it would not be blocking for responding with the HTTP status, but the server would still make the request to another internal service. And we did that for a while, especially for sending emails, every kind of background jobs. And at some point, we had a lot of internal API calls, and we still have some. But at some point, I wanted to bring a better kind of architecture to do this kind of things. And what people typically do is bring a message broker that is connecting to all microservices. So a service can just drop events or commands in the message broker, and service can also listen to events or commands and handle them.
Got it. So let me just see whether I understood correctly. So you basically have those HTTP endpoints. You're running them. Are you running them on something like AWS Lambda or on stateful servers?
Yes, everything runs in Kubernetes.
Okay, so you're running that in Kubernetes, so you have the benefit of long-running servers. Since one of the questions I would have had otherwise is, when you say fork daemon, now you basically need to think about like the request lifecycle, but otherwise also the lifecycle of a server. So if you have the lifecycle of a server, that makes that certainly easier. But the more complexity that you had sort of like as your app develops and evolves, typically it gets more complex than simpler over time. And so you always had that trade-off of like, you want to, if the client does something, it should get a request response as quickly as possible. And now you have that tension where on the one hand, you want to keep the response snappy and as quick as possible. And on the other side, you had more and more complexity, more and more stuff and features that should be handled. So far, you've always kind of let that run in the background by basically through the request response lifecycle would already create a effect fiber through like a fork. The details here don't matter too much, but the basically now the question is like the little job that now somehow runs through the event, like JavaScript event loop, that maybe gets out of control. Maybe like, what if you need to do error handling there? Maybe how many of those are running at the same time? So this is the situation you were facing. And now you thought about, okay, what is like the architecturally proper way to deal with that? And that is where you arrived at, let's look into event buses. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. So we wanted to have, I think, more control with this kind of background jobs. Also for like the structure of the data of the code base, we wanted to avoid like dependencies between services. Like some service, they just want to drop an event and they don't have to know about the API of other services. So it made more sense to just drop an event and not calling the service directly. Is also like a best practice, I think, in terms of software design. When your system gets complex, you want to have like better architecture and dependencies enforcement.
That makes sense. And so I just want to get a better understanding of like the nature of the things that should kind of happen in the background. Are those purely things that need to be kicked off, but are no longer relevant for the user experience in the front end? So like if you click a button in the front end, you're like getting the request response cycle back and a thing happens, and then you don't really care too much what is happening in the background? Or is there stuff that happens in the background that the front end might now be like polling for in some way?
Most of the time, we don't call responses. It's just like background, like I don't know, send an email, or we call. So we're also connected with blockchains, and blockchains are complex systems, but basically the registry of our funds are written on the blockchains, and the blockchains evolves. So a lot of events are happening on the blockchains, and we basically poll the blockchain continuously. We index all these events. And sometimes when a specific event happens, we want to trigger some code. So for these kinds of scenarios, it's really, really nice to have a event-driven architecture.
Got it. Yeah. So you're mentioning an event bus. So let's dive in. What did you do there? I suppose there are like many different options. You're not the first one to like embrace an event-driven architecture. So how did you go about that? Did you build something like that before? Did you have like any sort of relevant experience? Walk me through sort of like you getting up to speed on that topic and then evaluating different options to what you've ultimately implemented.
So we had like a discussion with all my team. There are many options, but first we preferred to use like an open source project. So we didn't want to be like tied to a specific cloud provider, like I don't know, SQS from Amazon, from AWS or Google PubSub. And basically, at the end, we had three main choices. So the first was Kafka, because Kafka is like widely used in big enterprise, and it's probably the most used in the financial sector. So it would have been a good fit for us. And the second choice was RabbitMQ, because it's battle tested, it's well used, plenty of plugins, etc. And the third was like the new to the game is Nats. It's more recent, but it's very lightweight and it seemed very nice. So we decided to eliminate Kafka because it was heavy to run locally, not easy to run on Kubernetes. I think there are great options to run it on Kubernetes, but it was not the lightweight options. Overall, we chose RabbitMQ because it was more battle tested, because it had a UI interface to play with, and so we were more confident with something that is a bit battle tested, and we didn't need like to have something that is super fast or that can handle millions of messages per second. Also, it's not a very critical choice for us because all the data that goes into RabbitMQ is not persistent. It's temporary because once the message is consumed, it disappears. So at some point, if we want to switch to another message broker, it could not be so hard for us to switch. So we were like, okay, RabbitMQ seems nice. Let's go and let's try it. But the adventure was a bit rough after we made that choice, because we discovered a lot of things that were not so nice about RabbitMQ and AMQP. And maybe if I knew them before, maybe I would have chosen something like that.
Let's definitely go into that. For those folks who have never used Rabbit, you also mentioned AMQP. Would you mind giving a quick explainer of what those are and how they relate to each other?
Sure. I'm not an expert, but here's my understanding. So AMQP is a protocol. It's like HTTP. It's a protocol that is standard for sending and consuming messages. And there are several brokers that implement this protocol. RabbitMQ is one of them, but you have other types of message brokers that implement AMQP. For instance, I think ActiveMQ, everything that has MQ in the name is probably a AMQP client and server. Actually, it's quite nice because AMQP is widely used. RabbitMQ is one of the most popular implementation of MQP server.
I think I've used RabbitMQ in the past, but it's been a little while. And I'm dealing with other kinds of event-driven systems these days where I'm exploring event sourcing more in a front-end context. Some similarities, but also very different when it comes to the use case that you're describing. So very curious to learn more about yours. So you mentioned that you were running into some issues with RabbitMQ. So maybe you can describe a little bit more chronologically how you went about it, what you were aiming for, which sort of assumptions or hopes did maybe turn out different than you thought, and what did you arrive at?
It's an interesting question. So when we started to implement a connection between RabbitMQ and our backend services, what we did was we basically wrapped the AMQP library into Effect. So we used the official library called AMQP lib, the official implementation for Node.js. Basically, when you connect to RabbitMQ from Node.js, you create two objects. One is the connection, so you initiate the connection, and then you initiate a channel, which represents a connection channel between the service, the client and the server. So you initiate these two objects, and what we did is we put them into, I think, a layer, an effect layer that was scoped. So when the dependency lifetime was ended, we could close the connection, close the channel. So that's pretty basic. And then we could just call our channel to send message and subscribe to events. What was a bit challenging is that at some point, we discovered that our services were not consuming messages anymore, or they were not sending messages anymore to the server. Why? Because the connection and the channel between client and server was closed at some point for any reason. Maybe the connection between the service and the server, it had a problem. So we are running the RabbitMQ in a Kubernetes cluster. It's quite safe because we use RabbitMQ as a cluster in our Kubernetes cluster. So we always have the persistence of messages and replications of events. But sometimes one node of the RabbitMQ cluster goes down, and then the connection between the service and the RabbitMQ node goes down. And the problem with the AMQP lib is that when the connection object is failing, there is no auto reconnection. So basically, the connection just drops. It was a challenge for us to implement an automatic reconnection of the service. So we iterated a bit on this problem. The first thing we did is that in our Kubernetes health check endpoint, we would add a check to see if the connection was alive. If the connection was not alive, so Kubernetes could just kill the pod and would start a new one with a fresh connection. But still, it was not a good solution because we were using some events. We had a lot of issues with that. What we did is we tried to implement a way to reconnect automatically, and that's how I ended up writing a library called Effect Messaging to wrap the AMQP connection, the AMQP channel, and add auto reconnection to this. In Effect, when you create a connection object and you provide it in a layer, then you can mutate the object that is in the layer. But in the AMQP lib, there is no function, there is no method on connection to refresh. So you have to replace the object completely. This was an interesting problem, and when I started implementing the effect messaging library, I digged a little bit into effects and into what data structure I could use to represent this, and I ended up using something I think I've never used in standard application, but so I ended up using the ref module to represent a mutable state. So what I did is, instead of providing a connection object from the MQP lib, I provided a ref of the connection, and then I could listen to events and to close events from the connection, and then refresh the connection and mutate the ref. And so people using the layer would have the new connection.
I love that you walked it through, from the high level down to the lowest level, what you needed to kind of understand and leverage some lesser known pieces of Effect to implement this. Even though it's very specific, what I think is universal about that experience that you went through is that Effect allows you to model the realities of your application at this point of your infrastructure. Since this is what, for me, most of software development is about. You're trying to figure out what is the goal, what are the building blocks, what are the materials, what are the pieces that we can use here. And then you need to develop what is sometimes referred to as mechanical empathy for the building blocks that you have. And here, mechanical empathy is understanding, okay, there's a connection. In an ideal world, this connection would suffice and would be super stable. And there's just one computer is never going down, super duper easy. But the tricky part here is we're dealing with distributed systems, and with distributed systems, there arise a ton of problems. And now you need to model for those cases. And the specifics is one thing here, but I think what is applicable to almost any situation is you need to model your reality of your application, of your system. And this is, I think, now that you've figured out what are the primitives of Effect that you need to use, you could use them and model your domain perfectly. And in a way where it doesn't feel it's kind of a one-to-one fit to reality and implementation. And maybe the first time you look at this, you might think oh, why are all of those things needed? But now that you understand it, you understand each piece here has a reason. And this is what I also appreciate about so many pieces in the Effect platform packages, etc., where maybe you look at it the first time, you think, wait, why are those three things needed? Isn't one sufficient? But then you realize, oh, actually, those are here for those various scenarios. And they're split up into three, that is not a leaky abstraction. So many things in the JavaScript ecosystems are designed in a leaky, abstracted way. And this is what I appreciate about Effect. It kind of absorbs the reality of the materials you're working with. And I think this is exactly what you've done in the Effect messaging layer. And also on a personal note, this definitely resonates in regards to the work I've been doing over the last couple of years, where I'm diving very deep into distributed systems, where reconnection, etc., is the bread and butter. So kudos to you to next to building a FinTech product, also dealing with distributed systems and building a library in that regard. So congrats, that is awesome.
I mean, no, it was super interesting, and I think it's also part of our job to have resilient system, and it's very important for our product. But it was a really fun experience to also do this kind of lower, it's lower level stuff that we rarely do in a fintech startup, because we often use like existing libraries. It's really fun, actually.
Well, and now for someone else, there is an existing library for that, where like someone can look at this and already absorb your mental model of the world. Like you had to do the modeling carefully yourself before, where you needed to figure out like, is this kind of abstraction modeling correct? Should there be more pieces? Can it be condensed more? And now someone can look and say like, okay, event-driven sounds great. RabbitMQ sounds great. Let me try that. And if you've designed it well, they are falling in a pit of success. So that is amazing. And now that you've created this environment for your fellow engineers, what is it like now to work with that system?
You mean like the developer experience with that library?
Exactly. You've created the world that you wanted to see. You wanted to have RabbitMQ as a message broker. You wanted from your API servers, wanted to publish events onto the message broker. So how is that working? And then we should also talk about the consumer side of like how those events are being processed and any sort of interesting things emerging from that.
Sure. I think the library of effect messaging at the moment, it's mainly solves the problem of reconnection and having a strong connection layer. And I also created a higher level interfaces like publisher interface and subscriber interface that can allow people to subscribe to events and publish. So at the moment, I kept this interface very generic, so we could add more message brokers to the library in the future if we want to. But at Spiko, we use RabbitMQ, so we use the AMQP publisher, AMQP subscribers. We don't have any more problem with connections and failing connections. Another abstractions on top of this publisher subscriber, where we have a strong typing of events and payloads, like event types payloads. But this is not in the effect messaging library. It's something we built on top in our code base. Basically, when we want to create a new event, we declare a new interface with an event type and a payload. Yeah, that's it. But maybe in the future, if we find the good abstraction for it, maybe we could add this kind of features to effect messaging. The vision I have maybe for this library would be to do something that is similar to HTTP API module, but to describe events. So it's a bit ideal world, and it's not done yet, but we could imagine something where you declare your messaging API with events and payloads in a declarative way, and you could create both a subscriber and the publisher for these events. Also, another parallel that is very interesting is that with HTTP API module, you can generate open API specs. And I've done a bit of research, and there is an equivalent in the async messaging world. There is an equivalent of open API called Async API. I don't think it's very popular yet, but it's a way to expose async messaging APIs. So it could be interesting in the future. Maybe we want to drop events from a Node.js application, and there's a new team using another language that wants to generate a subscriber for this event. He could use like a generic interface. You could use like a specification to generate a client for this event. Maybe in the future we'll have that. I don't know.
No, this makes perfect sense. And I do hope that Effect platform and more primitives inside of the core Effect ecosystem are moving in that direction, similar to what we've seen already with the Effect platform package, with the HTTP package, etc. So I think there are many scenarios where events are a super valuable primitive here in combination with RabbitMQ, but I think they're more universal than that. And I think there's like many related domains and problems that should be explored as well. I'm not sure how relevant like schema evolution, for example, here would be. I mean, there's a lot of problems and a lot of challenges that are explored at scale, like in the Kafka ecosystem, etc. And bring that more into the fold with core effects, I think would be super valuable. So kudos for you for already pioneering in that space. I'm actually curious for the events that you can publish and consume through effect messaging. Are you already embracing effect schemas for that?
I think the way we describe events is with schema, because we always use schema for decoding everything that comes from the outside world, because we can't trust the outside world. So we always decode everything that comes from the database. We have a persistence with PostgreSQL. So we use also Effect SQL, but we decode with schemas. And for messaging, we describe all the events with schemas, and we make sure we encode it and decode it with schemas.
Got it. Is the problem of schema evolution already becoming an issue? So you mentioned that you're not really persisting the events over a longer period of time, but they're rather like going onto the broker until they're taken off, and that's it. So the only like schema evolution scenario that I could think of is you have version 1 of the service rolled out, and then you're rolling out version 2. Somehow there's a period of time where you still have like a backlog of many messages, which are still of version 1. And now you've rolled out version 2 of the app. And now that kind of expects an event of version 2, but gets one of version 1. Have you faced that problem already? And have you kind of like modeled around it?
Yeah, we already faced that problem, and we're still a young company, and we don't have like millions of users. So sometimes we take the risk to publish, like to do a breaking change, because we don't have like big queues of messages that are being consumed. And if we deploy a breaking change, we have like a very low probability that we get an error by breaking the schema. If we really want to be careful, what we do is we try to avoid breaking changes, and then we have, I think, 2 options. Either we modify the existing schema in a non-breaking way, like for instance, we add a new optional field, or we could like just create a V2 or another version of the event.
That makes perfect sense. I'm just personally very interested in that problem domain. And so, for example, to say like we just don't do breaking changes, I think that's a super valid way to go. But I would like to get more safety rails and guardrails to like make sure that that is actually done. Maybe you're like in deep in like some refactoring, and like you just like have a type error over here, and you like jump to the schema definition, you add something, and like you don't even think about it. And like TypeScript is happy, the tests are passing, and you do that deployment on a Friday afternoon, and poof, the weekend is ruined. So how do we get a little bit more like systematized help that we say like, hey, this is a schema, and this schema doesn't just exist in a vacuum, but it exists sort of like in a chronological context and needs to be protected with like some special rules. This is something that I'm very curious about, and I think it's generally applicable to many parts where you need a schema. So obviously to databases as well. Databases have their own way of dealing with that. But let's say you will have like a little bit of like client-side storage that you have a schema for, and you always test your app, or like you rarely test your app going from version 1 to version 2. You test it from scratch in version 1 and from scratch in version 2, but you rarely test those transitions. And this is just something that I hope we get to explore with Effect Schema as well. So, but that sounds super cool. So how ready is Effect Messaging right now? If someone outside of Spiko says like, heck, I want to use that, how ready for production is it? Can people already use it?
I just want to rebound on what you were saying, because I think it's also an interesting problem. And then I answer your question about the richness of effect messaging. But avoiding breaking change is something really important. And we discovered something called, I think, the optic, that can compare like two versions of an open API file, and that can prevent breaking changes on open API specs. So I think I was really happy to discover this, because in Effect you can generate open API specs. It's taken to the library, and already, I mean, we can profit of the whole open API ecosystem, including this tool. It's a way to leverage the existing tools in open API to avoid breaking change. And I hope we can do this for messaging in the future as well. To answer your questions about effect messaging, yes, I mean, I think we are probably the only company using effect messaging in production, or at least I don't know any other companies who do. But yeah, it's working fine for us. So it's production ready in the sense that we are using it in production. But of course, I think if more people want to use it, maybe we discover some issues. And it's open source, so anyway, anyone can post issues and contribute.
That is awesome. And it seems like you have a public roadmap there laid out as well, which I assume are ideas you had along the way of thoughts that, oh, it would be cool if at some point, probably not promises that you're going to ship those in the near future. But that sounds very enticing. And it seems like you even considered supporting other message brokers, the one that we talked about initially, Kafka, Nats, Google PubSub, etc. So that is super interesting.
I think the vision is interesting. Maybe I won't have time to implement. Actually, I don't think I will have time to implement this, but it's open for everyone. And if someone is interested in writing a PubSub subscriber, PubSub publisher, I think I laid out like a very generic interface. So it might be a good way to start.
But I see you already have like one contribution pending from trusty GitHub Copilot.
Yeah, I wanted. I launched the Copilot. So I'm experimenting a bit this weeks with like agents. And
yeah, so maybe let's use that as a segue to talk about that topic specifically. I mean, AI agents, coding agents, etc., all the rage these days. I'm spending a lot of time myself, like exploring them, seeing where are they good at, where are they not yet good at, how can I use them for my own benefits, like for productivity reasons or just like quality of life improvements. So I'm curious where you found them most helpful, and particularly also in the context of Effect, maybe areas where you found them to be not great with Effect yet.
Good question. So I can speak a bit about my experience with the agents. So it's quite recent. I was not a fan of Cursor and not a fan of AI until a few weeks ago, a few months ago, I think, because I didn't find it very productive. Like everything that was written by the AI, I had to change it. I mean, it was more a loss of time, I think, than a productivity benefits. But after investing a bit of time into these agents and adding like good instructions, so I tested a few agents, a few things like VS Code with Copilot, Cursor, and also like CLIs now. There is a really interesting project called Open Code. I don't know if you heard of it, but I find it very interesting. Actually, I start to see some benefits using agents. I mean, I don't delegate everything to an agent, but now it really helps me to write code faster. I read everything and I make sure that it's written as I want it to be. It understands things like way better than before, because now with agents, before doing an edit to a file, it really research a lot. Like it goes on internet, it fetches documentation. So I set it up at the Effectmq for effect docs. I'm not sure it's very often used by my agent, but if the agent wants to know more about effect, he has access to the documentation theoretically. And now, like the fact that the agent is able to grab a lot of context from the code base, from internet, it makes it really better than before. It's quite impressive now, I think.
Yeah. And I mean, this is worth keeping in mind that this is developing super quickly. We're now recording this at late August 2025. If someone is watching this like a couple of months later, God knows like what sort of AI models are available by then. And I'm pretty certain this is the worst it's ever been as it is right now. So things are developing and improving very, very quickly. And this is a very important topic to me because I think it fundamentally changes what programming means. I hope that it will leverage us and elevate us as system designers to spend more time about like trying to understand the reality and like modeling the reality, like helping to like expressing like, hey, which parts of the reality do we need to model and which ones can we leave out? Like, is it important to model in that the server that you're running this on is like whatever in a silver casing or in a black casing? No, that part of the domain is not important. But does it sit in that one cluster or another? Like you get the point. And like I think this is more like modeling things, expressing intent. That is where I see things going. And the act of implementation is probably being taken away from us over time. That's at least like my understanding of the future right now. But I'm seeing it as glass half full because like what I see as the same as today is like that we're still looking for better materials to build applications with. And I'm convinced that AI is going to have a very good time building with Effect in the future, just because it is the best material to build applications with. But that I think we still have a long way to go to really help AIs to be very good at working with Effect. So you mentioned the Effect MCP, that already helps a lot, and it will get a lot better because we've recently switched over the Effect docs search to use a service and a tool called Mixspread, which does like smart AI indexing and retrieval. So if you now look for interruption, you actually now should get a much more useful result. And we're going to wire up the same thing for the Effect MCP as well. So that will mean that if an AI needs to look up interruption, it gets better context. So that's going to help a lot. But the other thing that AI really relies on delivering good results is that it's trained on various kind of like little snippets and examples. Similar to us humans, some of us are going to go to the source and read the source code and like apply a lot of mental horsepower to figuring out like how something should be used. But I think the majority much rather prefers to look for an example, like how can I use Effect Schema? How can I use Effect HTTP? Or how can I use Effect messaging? Instead of reading the source, reading an example, trusting that is correct, and then kind of like transfer applying that on your own domain. And this is where we still have a long way to go to like cover all the API use cases of Effect and helping the coding agent, giving it more training material. And once we have that, I expect a huge uptick in how good the results are that we're getting from coding agents for Effect. So that's something I'm keeping a close eye on and expect to see a lot of improvements there in the future. So as a last topic, we can look back on many years of Effect getting better, but it's barely getting started. What are you looking forward most to in the future of Effect?
Okay, it's a good question. So first, I'm excited to know that the team is working on the V4. And I'm not sure what impacts it will have for us, but I'm excited. I understand that it will have like performance benefits. I'm also excited to try out the Effect AI. So we were talking about AI for productivity with agents, but I think we could also use AI for application stuff, like for automating stuff in our business. For instance, I give you a very simple example, but when an investor wants to withdraw money from the platform, and he fills his bank number, and he has to send us a PDF or something from a document from the bank to justify that it's the correct number. And at the moment, we have to verify each document manually. And this is something we could automate with AI. So in the future, we could, for instance, have a service that calls an LLM, sending the bank account to check with the PDF. And we could ask for a structured response, like yes or no, or how confident are you? And based on this response, we could take a decision and programmatically validate or not the bank account.
I mean, I'd highly recommend you giving it a try. I've used the Effect AI package for very similar things myself. Like I've built a little invoicing system for myself that I use when I work with other people or send out invoices myself. I've used the Effect AI package particularly for that use case, and it just worked first try. So it is incredible what is possible with that. It's nowhere comparable to the amount of effort it takes to build effect messaging from scratch. But this will be a thing. You'll be done after 15 minutes, and it's going to significantly improve the capabilities of your products. So don't sleep on that.
Yeah, definitely. And actually, I think it's a big shift of mindset also. And I think I didn't really realize it until a few weeks ago, actually. The way I was interacting with LLM so far was just sending text, receiving text, but not structured text, not text I could decide to put in my code and do an if else on the result. But here it's completely different. I mean, it's a shift of mindset, and it's a revolution. I think for programming.
Most certainly. Well, I'm looking forward to the next time we have a chat to hear more about how you're leveraging the AI packages of Effect to ship new features. But Samuel, I want to thank you for taking the time and sharing your entire journey here. What you're building at Spiko sounds super, super cool. So seems like you all are hiring. So if you're based in Paris or want to move to Paris, I think Spiko is probably an interesting company to consider applying at. And yeah, also huge congrats on all the milestones you've reached recently on shipping Effect messaging. I hope that a lot more folks are using messaging patterns like that. I think it's a wonderful fit with Effect. And thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you so much as well. It's a real pleasure for me to participate to the podcast and also to be part of the community. So I want to thank you as well.
Perfect. Salut.
Salut.
Thank you for listening to the Cause and Effect podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, leave a review, and share it with your friends. If you haven't done so already, you can join our Discord community. And if you have any questions, feedback, or suggestions about this episode or about Effect in general, don't hesitate to get in touch. See you in the next episode.